While the tennis world was busy losing its mind over Jannik Sinner's doping controversy and picking apart every wince from Carlos Alcaraz's injured wrist, something happened that almost nobody talked about. Alexander Zverev quietly became the second-best tennis player on the planet. No press conference meltdown, no viral celebration, no federation investigation, just a ranking update, locked in after Wimbledon, that changed the entire picture of men's tennis, and somehow barely made a headline. Think about that for a second. In an era where every twitch of Sinner's eyebrow gets analyzed for 12 minutes, where every Alcaraz setback gets dissected for hidden meaning, the man who just passed Alcaraz in the rankings barely made a ripple. So here's the question we're actually asking today. How does a player climb to world number 2 without the tennis world blinking? Is this the sport quietly rewarding consistency over chaos, or is it a warning sign that we've all stopped watching the scoreboard and started watching the drama instead? Because here's what nobody's saying out loud. Carlos Alcaraz, a name that dominates thumbnails, timelines, and every next great rivalry conversation, just got passed. Not because Zverev pulled off some miracle upset, because he showed up week after week while Alcaraz's wrist kept him off the court. And that raises an uncomfortable question for everyone covering this sport, including us. Are we covering tennis, or are we covering noise? Zverev's rise to #2 isn't an accident, and it isn't a fluke of a slow season. It's the product of something specific, his first career Grand Slam title, a live race surge that's put him within striking distance of Sinner, and an opponent above him who simply wasn't there to defend his spot. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this happened, what it means heading into the US Open, and why the player everyone stopped talking about might be the one to watch most closely for the rest of the year. Because a #2 ranking doesn't just look good on paper. It changes seedings. It changes draws. It puts Zverev on a collision course with Sinner in a final instead of a semifinal, and pushes Alcaraz into the part of the bracket where anything can happen before he even gets there. And if Zverev's climb continues on this trajectory, the players chasing Grand Slams this fall might have a much bigger problem than they realize. Stay with us, because by the time this video ends, you'll never look at the who's #2 question the same way again. To understand how Alexander Zverev climbed the rankings without anyone noticing, you have to go back to a tournament most casual fans had already stopped paying attention to by the second week: Roland Garros. While the pre-tournament storylines were all about Sinner's dominance and whether Alcaraz could defend his title on clay, Zverev was quietly grinding through his draw. Final after final, semifinal after semifinal, the kind of results that don't generate highlight reels, but do generate ranking points. Zverev entered the tournament having already reached 2 finals on the season. Paris is where it changed from solid year to something bigger. He beat Flavio Cobolli in the final to win his first career Grand Slam title. Not his first Masters, not his first ATP Finals. His first major, at 29 years old, after 2 previous Grand Slam final losses that many assumed would define his legacy as the best player never to win one. That single result did 2 things at once. It silenced the nearly man narrative that had followed him for years, and it launched him into second place on the ATP Live Race to Turin, trailing only Sinner, while sitting comfortably ahead of the player everyone still assumed was the clear world number 2, Carlos Alcaraz. But Zverev's climb wasn't only about what he was doing right. It was also about what was happening to the man in front of him. Carlos Alcaraz missed Roland Garros entirely with a wrist injury. Then he missed the grass court tune-up events. By the time Wimbledon's seedings were locked in, Alcaraz's ranking was already sliding, and it kept sliding through the tournament itself, since points earned on tour don't pause for recovery. That's the part of this story that almost never gets said out loud. Rankings don't just measure who's winning, they measure who's still standing. And through the middle of 2026, Zverev was standing when it mattered, while the player above him wasn't playing at all. When the dust settled after Wimbledon, the new ATP Top 10 was locked in regardless of the finals outcome. And it told a story nobody had been covering. Zverev, world number 2. Alcaraz, dropped to number 3. Felix Auger-Aliassime consolidating at number 4. Alex de Minaur hitting a career high at number 5. Even Djokovic, still a magnet for headlines every time he laces up, sat outside the top 5, at number 7. So this wasn't a fluke week. It was the product of a full season. A Grand Slam title earned the hard way, a live race surge that put him within striking distance of Sinner, and an opponent above him who simply wasn't on court to defend his spot. And that timeline raises the real question this video is built around. Is Zverev's rise built to last through the US Open? Or is it a window that closes the moment Alcaraz's wrist heals? That's what the numbers are about to tell us. Let's talk about the number that started this whole conversation. 44 wins, 11 losses. That's Zverev's 2026 season record. And on its own, it's good. But plenty of players have good records without becoming world number 2. What matters is where those wins came from. Start with Roland Garros. A maiden Grand Slam title at 29 years old, won by beating Flavio Cobolli in the final. That result alone was worth enough points to vault him into second place on the ATP Live race to Turin, trailing only Sinner, and sitting comfortably ahead of Alcaraz by well over 1,000 points. Now here's where it gets interesting. 6 weeks later, Zverev walked into his first ever Wimbledon final, and he lost. Sinner beat him in 4 sets, 6-7, 7-6, 6-3, 6-4, coming back from a set down to defend his title. Normally, a Grand Slam final loss is a footnote, a so close, yet so far story. But this one didn't cost Zverev his ranking momentum, because the rankings for that week were already locked in before the final was even played. Whether he won or lost that match, Zverev was guaranteed to overtake Alcaraz. The result mattered for the trophy. It didn't matter for the number next to his name. That's the mechanic almost nobody talks about, and it's the whole point of this video. A ranking climb isn't only built by winning, it's built by showing up, by playing enough matches, deep enough into enough draws, while someone else isn't on the court at all. And that's exactly what happened to Alcaraz. Missed Roland Garros, missed the grass court tune-ups. Every one of those skipped tournaments was a tournament where Zverev, or somebody else, had a chance to bank points that Alcaraz simply couldn't defend or add to. Now, let's be honest about the other side of this story, because a fair analysis has to include it. Zverev's record against the very top of the game, the handful of players ranked inside the top 10 when he faced them, has been rough this season. Single-digit wins against a stack of losses. That's not a small footnote. It's the single biggest question mark hanging over this ranking. Because rankings measure points, not dominance. Zverev is the world number 2 by the numbers. But if you ask which Player Tour insiders expect to win the next head-to-head meeting between him and Sinner, or him and a healthy Alcaraz, the honest answer is, probably not Zverev. So here's the real picture forming. Zverev's climb is legitimate, earned through a genuine Grand Slam title, a deep Wimbledon run, and remarkable consistency across a long season. But it's also propped up, in part, by circumstance, an injured rival who wasn't there to defend his position. Both things can be true at once. That's not a knock on Zverev. That's just what elite tennis rankings actually are. A running total, not a power ranking of who'd win if everyone met on the same day. Which brings us to the part of this story that actually decides what happens next. What does a number 2 ranking mean for the US Open? And can Zverev hold on to it once Alcaraz comes back healthy? So what does a world number 2 ranking actually change for Alexander Zverev? More than most fans realize. Rankings decide seeding, and seeding decides the shape of a player's entire tournament. As the number 2 seed heading into the US Open, Zverev is protected from facing Sinner until the final, not the semifinal, not the quarterfinal. Every match before that final is, on paper, winnable. That's the tangible reward for a season of consistency, a clearer runway to a second Grand Slam final in a row. But there's a catch, and it's the same one we flagged in the stats section. Zverev is heading into the North American hard court swing with points to defend, not just points to gain. Last year, he reached the semifinals at both the Canada and Cincinnati Masters events, which means he needs to match those results just to stay level in the rankings. Anything less, and the points he banked from Roland Garros and Wimbledon start bleeding away before he even gets to Flushing Meadows. That's the part of being number 2 that doesn't get talked about enough. Climbing is the hard part, but defending is the part that actually determines whether a ranking sticks. A lot of players have spent a few weeks at a career-high ranking only to slide right back down the moment their own results from a year ago come due again. Now factor in the man he passed. Carlos Alcaraz's wrist injury isn't a season-ending situation. It's a matter of when he returns, not if. And the moment he's back on tour, healthy, playing full schedules again, a huge chunk of Zverev's cushion at number 2 is under threat. Alcaraz doesn't need to have a career year to close that gap. He just needs to start playing tournaments again. So here's the real stakes going into the US Open. This isn't just about whether Zverev can win his second Grand Slam of the season. It's about whether he can build enough of a points cushion over the next 6 weeks that Alcaraz's eventual return doesn't immediately erase everything Zverev has worked for since Paris. And there's a bigger prize sitting behind all of this: the Nitto ATP Finals in Turin in November. Zverev is a 2-time champion at that event, and his surge up the live race standings has him firmly inside qualification position, trailing only Sinner. A strong US Open doesn't just protect his ranking. It could put him in serious contention to close the year as the second best player in the world, full stop. Not just for one ranking week, but for the entire season. That's what makes this story bigger than one number on one Monday. It's not just Zverev is number 2 right now. It's a live question that plays out over the next several months. A points race against time, injury recovery, and a rival who's about to come back hungry. So let's go back to the question we opened with. How does a player climb to world number 2 without the tennis world blinking? The answer, it turns out, isn't complicated. It's just unglamorous. There was no meltdown, no controversy, no viral moment to hang a headline on. There was a Grand Slam title earned the long way, a first Wimbledon final that mattered more for its ranking implications than its result, and a rival who simply wasn't on the court to defend his spot. None of that trends. All of it counts. And maybe that's the actual story here. Not just about Zverev, but about how we, as fans, and as a sports media, decide what deserves our attention. Sinner's dominance gets dissected point by point. Alcaraz's every setback becomes a week-long narrative. Meanwhile, the player who quietly became the second best in the world barely got a mention outside the rankings page. If that doesn't say something about where our focus has drifted, it's hard to know what would. But let's not overcorrect either. This isn't a case for crowning Zverev as the sport's next dominant force. His record against the very best players in the world this season tells a more complicated story than his ranking does. A number 2 ranking earned partly through an opponent's absence is real. The points are real, the seeding is real, the Grand Slam title is absolutely real. But it's not the same as being the second most feared player on tour. Those are 2 different things, and this video was built on keeping that distinction honest. What happens next is genuinely uncertain, and that's what makes this worth following instead of just filing away. Can Zverev defend his Canada and Cincinnati points before Alcaraz returns to full health? Can he turn a maiden Grand Slam title into sustained pressure on Sinner at the top, rather than a one-tournament peak? And when Alcaraz does come back, not injured, not managing pain, just playing, how many weeks does Zverev actually get to hold this ranking before the natural order reasserts itself? Nobody knows those answers yet. That's exactly why this storyline deserves more attention than it's getting, not less. The US Open is going to answer at least part of it, and the Nitto ATP Finals in November could answer the rest. Whether this was a season-defining breakthrough for a player who spent years being called the best without a Grand Slam, or a temporary gap that closes the moment his rival walks back onto a tennis court at full strength. Either way, here's the takeaway we want you to leave with. Rankings tell you a story, but they don't always tell you the whole story. Sometimes the loudest headlines are covering the least important developments, and sometimes the most important shift in a sport happens in complete silence, one ranking update at a time. Zverev's climb to number 2 is proof of that. The only question left is whether he can make it mean something more than a temporary line on a chart. That's it for this one. If you think Zverev's ranking is legitimate or think it's just a product of Alcaraz's absence, drop your take in the comments. We want to hear where you land on this. And if you want us to keep tracking this storyline through the US Open and into Turin, let us know, because this one is far from finished.